Hello, everyone. This is Yvette Kelly with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the From Residential to Community-Based Care, Embarking on a New Path webinar. Before we get started, I just want to take a few moments to orient you to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. If you have not done so already, please call into the webinar using the audio conference information found in the event tab above the slide deck. Upon joining the webinar, you will be placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract you from listening to the webinar. If you happen to come across any technical issues during the webinar, please chat to the host, Brianna, who will be able to assist you. Please note that you will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat box, which is located on the right side of your screen. If it does not appear, just click the dialog bubble on the top right toolbar and it should pop up. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will address them during the Q&A portion at the end of today's presentation. Please note that today's webinar, you have the ability to get a continuing education credit for attending today. In order to do so, you will need to log into the portal here and create a profile, select today's webinar and pay the appropriate fee, as well as take a knowledge test. The knowledge test will be made available to you within the next week, and you will receive an email with this information within 24 hours of this webinar. So if you are interested in that, please remember to go in and register through the portal. Also, just want to remind you that this webinar is going to be part one in a three-part series, and the next webinar that is going to be in the series is going to take place on January 15th at the same time, and the title of the webinar is called Culture-Driven Leadership. So we're going to ask that if you could tune in for that one as well. Okay. So today's webinar, as I mentioned, is part one in a three-part series, which is focused on the efforts underway nationally to redesign the role of residential treatment services. Some of the strategies presented during the series will be action steps that you can do today, while there will be other strategies that won't be able to be realized until the state transitions to a value-based system. But we think that it's important to note as we think about the possibilities moving forward. I'd now like to take the opportunity to introduce our presenter today, Bill Martone, whose work in residential treatment services includes rethinking and redefining the role of residential in the continuum of care. And just so we know who has joined us today, we are asking you to identify your role within your agency, and if you could complete the polling question that you see. We'll give you a few minutes to do that, and that just helps us understand who's on the line. Okay. Give us a few minutes for the results to come in. All right, so it looks like we have a good variety, but mostly our directors and administrators, and we just, again, want to thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I am going to pass it off to Bill Martone.
Thanks, Yvette. Good morning, everyone. And greetings from the West Coast. It's sunny, unseasonably cold, and dry as a bone here. We have the promise of El Nino coming, but it still hasn't come to Southern California. And when I got a chance to look at the weather maps for New York, it looks like it ranges from sunny to blizzard conditions in the western part of the state that some of you are potentially looking forward to this evening. So anyone wants to send any of that precipitation our way would be greatly appreciated. So As we move into today's agenda, I'm really going to begin looking at how an organization can move from residential to community-based services, or expand the community-based services that you're going to or are currently offering. So I'm going to go over quickly some of the goals for the seminar series, the webinar series, a little bit of my background, some emerging trends, give you an example of an organization that moved through this kind of transformation, and then talk with you about some tools to assess where your organization is at. So the goals for this series are to help support you in identifying the strengths of your organization specific to obtaining sustained positive outcomes for youth and families. Secondly, to support you in increasing your understanding about the organization's capacity for developing or expanding community-based services, and hopefully increasing your enthusiasm and understanding regarding specific strategies that you can go back and utilize, as Yvette indicated, either now or down the road. So just to give you a little bit of my background, born and raised in the Albany, New York area, and my first job was at what was then the Albany home, became Parsons, which has now merged, and there I started as a child care worker, working with emotionally disturbed children on a residential unit, and gained much valuable experience from doing that, and eventually directed the residential program there. I then had an opportunity to move to Chicago, a Children's Home and Aid Society, and oversaw their residential programs and specialized foster care services. And then in 1994, had the opportunity to move to California with an organization that at the time was known as the Sycamores, and really begin working with them on some significant transformation and movement towards community-based services that the board was looking at. And I'll tell you a little bit more in a moment about why and what that was about. I've also been doing some work with the Building Bridges Initiative in Minnesota, in Ohio, Louisiana, Providence, and Boston have been some of the other cities. And some of the Alliance for Stronger Families and Communities project on residential transformation, and I've served as a peer faculty in several states with different organizations, Nebraska, again, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania. And I've got some upcoming work with agencies that are in South Dakota, Kansas, Ohio, and Nebraska. So just to give you a little sense of who I am. I really want to start with an experience that I had early on in my residential career, working with a young man called Freddie. And Freddie looked an awful lot like the young man you see in this picture. He was cute as a button, and he loved to entertain us as staff. He would become C.W. Fields, Groucho Marx, and just became this wonderful entertainer to the staff. And I had an opportunity after being there for a while to go with the social worker from the unit on a visit to downstate New York and meet with Freddie's mom. We took Freddie along to go for this home visit. And when we entered, as you go kind of into a new environment, you're kind of greeting the person at the door, and that was his mom. But you're also kind of taking in that environment, and that's what we were doing. And it was this mixture of greeting and taking in what we were experiencing. And what we were experiencing was that the decorations were quite unusual in this home. And as we had a few moments to look closer, we saw that there really wasn't wallpaper in the home, but the walls were papered with cutouts from movie star magazines. And every picture on the wall was that of a movie star. And it quickly became clear that Freddie's only way of getting Mom's attention was to become one of those characters on her wall. And had we not done that home visit, had we not been in the community and spending time with that family in the community, we would have never known or understood Freddie's behavior. So it's always stuck for me the importance of that community involvement, being in the community with families and building community services that help us so much better understand what's happening in families' lives. So why consider moving services to communities? There are some emerging trends that I wanted to go over with you and take a look at. Tom Wall, who is from the Strategic Change Initiative and is working with the Alliance Residential Transformation Project, each year talks to over 400 public officials and leaders in organizations throughout the country and gathers an updated list of the trends. His 2016 list, which is before you, is about to be released next month, and you have a preview of the trends that he's hearing about and experiencing and talking with the public officials. And I'm sensing that some of these may be things that you're also experiencing in New York. So first, expecting less money from local, state, and federal governments, I think, is something everyone is experiencing across the country. There's just not enough dollars to do the work that we need to do, and there's no new dollars. We're often asked to do more things, but with no new money. There's a strong emphasis by service purchasers on reducing cost, which goes hand in hand with the first of the trends. And then many are saying they only want to buy evidence-based practices in terms of what they're going to be purchasing from us as organizations. And most are saying they want to buy results instead of services, and they want those to be results that can be sustained and long-lasting for 6 to 12 months or even longer. And there's a clear movement from child-centered to family-focused service delivery, and much of that taking place in the community. Folks are talking about faster moves towards permanency for children not returning home. Engagement is seen as the means and stability as the end. Reemergence of a focus of Maslow's hierarchy of needs for families, and promoting safe, secure, calm, and wellness as a result of the efforts that we're doing in our work. Next is preparing for success with a stable family is the new test to teach for. And then the ones that I thought related significantly to building community services I've kind of highlighted in the red color. Emphasis on making community connections to existing resources and emphasis on working with the working poor to help get better paying jobs. A focus on emphasizing on helping to build natural supports, networks for families. Care coordination and aftercare are seen as essential services that residential providers should be offering as part of their array. And then a movement away from one-size-fitting-all towards individualism and a push to redesign all existing services to ensure more durable results. There's an emphasis on learning how to teach normal developmental processes, an emphasis on using wraparound design to help meet family needs, and I'm going to talk more about an experience I had within an organization regarding the importance of that. And then an emphasis on identifying and addressing the impact of trauma. I know many of you in New York have really begun focusing on that whole issue of trauma, introducing the sanctuary model, trauma-informed care. Some of you are using the search institutes for the assets. So I think everybody is really making a concerted effort to begin focusing on that area. One of the trends is really developing guidance for staff behaviors in their work. We often at times struggle with how our residential staff work with young people, and we don't always see the kinds of interactions that we're really hoping to see from staff. So really being able to provide some guidance to staff in terms of their work with children and their work with families. Emphasis on shorter durations of service whenever possible, on continuing to reduce the use of out-of-home care, emphasis on using out-of-home care primarily for crisis stabilization. So we're seeing this short-term 30-day use. We have some programs even under 30 days across the country now in terms of their lengths of stay. An emphasis on developing an integrated collaborative system of care. And I'll talk a little bit about the Building Bridges effort in a moment and how that was really designed to help enhance that collaboration. There's an emphasis on changed leadership as a method to adapt organization, using strategic data to analyze and inform decision-making, significant efforts to integrate physical and behavioral health. I think you're seeing that in New York with the advent of managed care and the health homes that are being formulated as part of that plan. And then a call for collaborative relationships with primary health care providers, which ties greatly to that whole effort. And then efforts to strengthen and enforce performance-based contracts. So we're seeing sort of across the country much more performance-based contracting coming from our public partners. There's continued movement towards more risk sharing and managed care, emphasis on developing and improving training and support for line staff, an emphasis on finding ways to adjust organizational identity and culture, and that's some of what we're going to be talking about next month in terms of the webinar series. An emphasis on community-based over campus-based service delivery, need for new business plans and more sophisticated financial systems to manage what we're being asked to do. A changing public sector role, moving away from direct service delivery, a lot of privatization happening in some localities across the country. Public sector to focus more on defining community priorities, and public sector to focus more on developing and enforcing contracts. And I really think 39 is a very important one. The public sector is looking for solution-finding partners for systems of care. And I think the more we as providers can join with our public sector in a dialogue, the more we will be able to move and advance forward the kinds of results that we want to see for children and families. And finally, flexible, responsible, capable, and collaborative are some of the key trend words that we're seeing out there. So I wanted to talk about reinventing the organization and really use a case example from Hathaway Sycamores, which was the organization I retired from at the beginning of this year and had really worked with them for over 20 years in moving through some organizational change. So to give you a little bit of background about this organization and some of the things that we went through, I joined the agency in '94. It was a niche 60-bed residential program, high-end kids, the highest level of acuity in the state. Referrals were from child welfare, probation, and educational placements. We were doing some very beginning family work. It was all campus-based. We did picnics with families. We did campus visits. We were beginning to experiment a little bit with home visits in this organization, but we really had a long way to go towards really becoming community-focused in terms of what we were doing. The board had a significant concern in '94 about what managed care might mean. So we got 20 years later before we began seeing some of that advent in California, but it really helped us prepare and move the organization to begin to address that. So in '94, we really entered into a strategic planning effort that at the time was a 5-year strategic plan. We used it as a living document, however, and every year reviewed and updated that plan, so it wasn't a shelf strategic plan that we built. If I were giving you suggestions today, I would say that you really need to use a process that's ever-going and ever-changing. David LaPiana has some great tools in terms of really building a strategic planning process that's continual and up-to-date and keeps you really informed and moving in a very positive direction. In 2000, probably one of the defining moments for the organization was becoming a wraparound agency in Los Angeles. Part of our initial strategic plan got us to build some step-down residential programs, some school-based programs, some community service programs, foster care, adoption kinds of services, resource centers in the community, neighborhood resource centers. But wraparound for the organization really became the defining change. Utilizing the wraparound principles of strength-based, culturally relevant, family-driven really changed the way we began doing the work. The contract in Los Angeles required us to hire a parent partner and really begin adding peer-to-peer support in that program. And we found that philosophy so positive and so beneficial for the work that we were doing in the wraparound program, we actually began taking that philosophy and spreading it through all of those other programs and services that I mentioned. And additionally built a parent-partner program. We started with one parent partner and grew that program significantly. And then we introduced parent partners into the residential milieu. And it was probably one of the key steps in helping us transform, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. In 2004, we partnered with our Department of Children and Family Services, along with 4 other agencies, brought to them a proposal to do what we called residential wraparound, or ResWrap, and that really began to transform the way we began to deliver residential services. In 2005, the organization did a merger. We had 187 residential beds in 2005. We added a parent partner to our board of directors to really help the board become well aware of the role of families in our work. And 5 years later, in 2010, we had 34 beds. So we had a dramatic drop, as you can see, in the number of residential beds that we were using. And also in 2010, we began offering our residentially based services. So as I began looking at this transformation process, we really began talking about changing the metaphor of placement. And some of the things that we were dealing with, and I know that you're dealing with in New York, one was the environmental changes for us. There was, at this time, we began this transformation, and especially as we hit the recession in 2008, a significant lack of fiscal resources. California was looking at billions of dollars of deficits. When we hit 2008, we had rate cuts, we had lawsuits. The advocates were really focusing on the fact that young people in the foster care system were not getting the mental health services that they needed. And we had several major lawsuits that began assuring that the public entities were going to provide the kinds of mental health services that young people were really entitled to. Our state association, Your Nice Kafka, really began looking at rate reform. We ended up suing the state of California through our equivalent to Nice Kafka and got a rate increase in our 4E funding for residential programs. And for the organization, during this time, we really saw continued growth in our community-based services. I think the other transformational thing for us was national accreditation. National accreditation seemed to have a strong foothold in the East Coast and Midwest, but when I got to California, it really didn't have a stronghold on the West Coast. We became Joint Commission accredited in 2000, and we were only one of 2 Joint Commission accredited agencies in the Los Angeles area at that time for a child welfare, behavioral health care kind of organization. Today, our state association is requiring national accreditation. I'm not sure if the federal legislation on child welfare reform financing has been released yet, but I had a preview of some of Wyden's bill, and in it is a push towards national accreditation that's being recommended within that legislation. So for anyone that has not achieved national accreditation yet, that's really potentially on the horizon for the feds as something they're going to be looking for. It really helped Hathaway Sycamores develop data-driven decision-making and really focus on using data to help us in reaching decisions through the organization. We also began really performance improvement focus. Started with accreditation, and then in 2000 we began what we called a Performance Excellence Project, which was really a quest for a state and national quality award. Through the Malcolm Baldrige standards, we achieved the California Awards for Performance Excellence bronze level through really transforming the organization along those performance excellence standards. Our agency-wide implementation of wraparound philosophy, which I mentioned, and it started in 2000, really focused on strength-based service delivery and families as partners, and that was a key to the work that we were doing. We developed child and family team approaches to the work, and one of the things we were seeing is that the children in our community-based wraparound programs were no different than the young people that were coming into our residential program, and yet we were getting better outcomes in our wraparound program than we were in residential. And that really led to the ResWrap, and I'll talk more about that in a second, that we built combining these philosophies. The other thing that we embraced was the Building Bridges initiative. We really embraced the values and principles that we use to continue to drive change, and those were also adapted by our state association and the residentially based service project that we started in California. So I mentioned parent partners being a big part of the work that we were doing. We started with one when we began wraparound. We grew to a program of parent partners of having 40 peer-to-peer support, peer advocates that were employees of the organization. And I mentioned that it really began to change the dialogue in our residential program by having a parent partner or parent partners in the program physically. Their office was with supervisors or clinicians, and they were involved in all aspects of the work that we were doing. They were involved in hiring new staff. They were involved in greeting a child and family as they entered. They were involved in treatment planning. Really all aspects that you can think of, we involved them. And that really began to change some of the dialogue with our staff, who often use language or put down families, their belief in families, and the parent partners were really there to begin to change that dialogue and gently question the values and beliefs that our staff had about families. And that really began to transform the work that we were able to do with families in the residential program. Our ResWrap program, which was the Homeward Bound pilot that we called it, was really a combination of the residential treatment facility with a wraparound philosophy and really emphasized the importance of a child and family team. We implemented it with 4 agencies in 2004. As I mentioned, we brought this to the county. Each agency did a slightly different approach in the model. We all brought our own excess dollars that we had achieved in wraparound in the community to this program. We were told by our county that we could only use those dollars for new and enhanced services, and we decided to use some of the excess revenue that we had built up to introduce the ResWrap model. And we really began to achieve a significant reduction in the length of stay. I think, typical to many residential programs across the country. At the time, in 2004, we were experiencing long lengths of stay for some young people, and really were not getting them to community-based services in a very exponential time frame. This model allowed us to begin to achieve lengths of stay by involving the family, creating a child and family team from the get-go, really down to 9 months, which made a significant difference in the work that we were doing. Part of that work, and this was the child welfare population that we were serving in this ResWrap approach, was family search and engagement. As an organization, when we started Wraparound in 2000, we were hiring private detectives to help us identify and find families, and really use that process for a while till technology caught up, and you could use, USA Search and a number of different tools online to begin to do the same things that private detectives have been doing for us. But we really built into the model a family search and engagement process. We also incorporated directive supervision. If any of you have crossed paths with Pat Miles, who's a national wraparound consultant, part of what she's developed was a directive supervision, which really helped direct line staff and clinical staff focus on the precision of their interventions with appropriate feedback from consumers. At one point, we had brought this to all levels of the organization. The other thing we did as an agency was to create a core practice model. We built this ourselves, and it eventually became used in our county and in the statewide approach through some of the settlements with the lawsuits that required that we utilize a core model of service delivery. And next month I'll talk a little bit more about that practice model and some of the components of what that's doing. Today, our county is beginning to not only talk about the core practice model, but discussing underlying needs that that model needs to address for the young people that we're serving. And then finally, in 2010, we started a pilot, and it was our residentially based service demonstration project. And there were 4 counties in California and 3 providers in Los Angeles that launched this. And it was a 17-bed pilot that was really based in Los Angeles off our ResWrap approach and used to transform services in California. And if I have a couple minutes at the end, I'll try to take you through a couple slides around that program. And in the slide deck, you'll find a whole presentation on the RBS program and all the different components of it. So if we don't get to it in the time we have this morning, I'd encourage you to take a look at that and see some of the components that are in there. If we look just at the values that it was introducing, is children belong at home in their community. Families are the experts on themselves and their children, and they need to be involved in the work that we're doing. Therefore, the child and family teams. Family culture is acknowledged and honored. Planning and treatment are individualized and strength-based, and family involvement and connections are essential, and strong communities make for strong families, and really doing whatever it takes. So in a quick overview, RBS took a residential length of stay. It could be no more than 10 months, or we experienced significant financial reduction in the rate that we were paid. We really got to a 6-month length of stay with the young people that we were working with. And again, it was the highest acuity level of young people. And then we had an 18-month community period of time where we worked with these young people in their homes. We had some options for crisis stabilization and respite care, and we can talk more about those in the future, but it really began to allow us to achieve significantly less lengths of stay in our organization. So to give you a sense, in 1994, residential had a budget out of about $6 million of a little over $3 million. For those of you that likes percents, it was 61% of our budget in 1994. In 2011, as we started the fiscal year, residential had dropped significantly to a little over close to $4 million of what was approximately a $50 million budget, or percent-wise about 7.6% between our demonstration project and our traditional residential program within that budget. So you see that we had a significant growth in community-based services and community-based mental health. The mental health, that was 71% of our budget, had a very small component of outpatient, office-based kinds of services, and most of that mental health services were in schools, in communities, family service partnerships, and a number of different methodologies. So today, in 2015, the organization has a budget of approximately $55 million. So from that last slide that I showed you, we had a growth in community-based services of approximately $5 million in that time period. So let's talk for a couple minutes about assessing where your organization is at, both with residential as well as community-based services. In 2004, Gary Blau came to an AACRC, American Association of Children's Residential Centers conference, did a presentation and really challenged residential programs to think about reforming and really connecting with community-based programs, and we really talked about building a bridge between residential and community-based services. That led to the formation of the Building Bridges Initiative. The mission statement is on the slide, and it really talks about that coordinated partnership and collaboration between community and residentially based service treatment providers. With really assuring that comprehensive services and supports are family-driven, youth-guided, strength-based, culturally and linguistically competent, individualized, evidence and informed, and consistent with research on sustained positive outcomes. I think you'll see in there many of the wraparound principles that we talk about. So this assessment tool, which if you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you to take a look at. The self-assessment tool was really established as some guideposts for operationalizing principles and practices of that joint resolution, really providing information about the degree of continuity and seamlessness of integration and support services that you offered, both in your residential and community settings, and was really a platform to begin to stimulate some of the thinking around quality improvement. The self-assessment tool was really not intended to help with compliance in any way. I think all of you have a host of regulatory bodies that are already monitoring you, and we at one time felt we really needed to create an office of standard monitoring by our public entities, because it seemed that every week we had someone new coming in, from licensing to mental health to child welfare, really reviewing our practices, and it just felt at times we almost needed a whole office to handle all of the demands that came through. And then the self-assessment tool really was not designed to handle other resources that are already there around cultural competency and wraparound fidelity. They're already out there. And it really, though, became a tool that looked at several different elements. And the elements that were incorporated into this assessment were the child and family team, family-driven practices, youth-guided practices, cultural and linguistic competence, entry into residential. What did that entry coming in look like? What was the service during residential, and what happened post-residential, and that community system of care? And were we linking the way that this process was intended with community services, and then performance and evaluation of the system of care? So this assessment tool was really designed to be used with various groups: residential staff, community, advocates, youth, families, funders, oversight agencies, and there were a variety of approaches that people could begin to use to incorporate this, whether it was a lead staff using the tool with one discipline at a time, with various dialogues that you had, with community dialogues with families, with dialogues with youth. Folks began to incorporate this and use it in many different ways. Internal staff development and training, simulation exercises for training, facilitating discussions around the ratings that you discovered, convening discussions of individual teams as promising best practices really emerged out of the self-assessment that you did, using sections for quality improvement discussions, creating learning collaboratives. There's a whole list, as you see on the slide. So for those of you that are not familiar with the tool, these are a couple slides of examples. This is the youth-guided practice section. It really kind of uses a Likert scale from 1 to 5 and lets you rate where you see things, and then you can really look at the results from various folks that are filling this out and really get an overview and sense of where your organization is at with each of these different sections. There's a section on community systems of care that again asked a series of questions. Community agencies work together to support family and youth in the following ways. Communities embrace the diverse cultures. Really lets you begin to start talking about and looking about the work that you're doing. When we did our residentially based service model, we used this tool. All of the 3 providers that were in this project administered it at the start. We did it with our demonstration project, and I know some of your organizations are at the moment looking at developing some demonstration projects for the under 12 population. We used this tool as we launched our demonstration project and did a comparison with our traditional RCL programs. We conducted this survey with our residential staff, community staff, advocates, youth, and families, and then we did it with our funders and oversight agencies. We didn't get a huge response from that group, but we got some significant information about how our funders and our oversight agencies were really looking and seeing our organization, and that really helped us focus on some of what we felt was going to be crucial in terms of improvements for us. And then we were re-administering this about 4 years after the start of our project. So as I began pulling some materials together for this webinar, I wanted to see if there were some other tools out there for organizational assessment, especially around building services for community. And one that I came across was from the Center for Public Skills Training, and it's their capacity building toolkit. And it really looks at some organizational capacity domains. It looks at organizational development, including management and planning practices and your governance and financial practices. It looks at program development and examples that include quantity and scope of services you're offering. It looks at revenue development, focusing around planning and training and resources that you have to engage the development of new community programs. It looks at leadership and where your leadership is at, and your community engagement around your community services. And it really asks you to look at a series of questions around mission, vision, strategy. Does the agency have a mission and vision that addresses community? And is it included in your strategic plan? It looks at governance and leadership questions around the organization having a strong and effective leadership at both the staff and board level that is committed to building an array of community services. It looks at that resource service development. Do you have the necessary resources, people and financial to develop community-based services? It looks at the internal operations and management through a series of questions around your HR policies and procedures, staff recruitment, retention, staff development. Looks strategically at some relationships and service delivery. So this is an example from the toolkit that looks at internal management. Again, it's sort of a scale where through a series of questions, you can rate yourself and your organization and see where you're at. Some of the service delivery areas are included in here, and some of the strategic relationships. The link for this is in the presentation. There's a hyperlink there, or you can just go to that website address if this toolkit makes some sense for you as a way of looking at your capacity, your existing capacity, your future capacity in terms of delivering community-based services. So this slide really just has an example of, I'm sure, many services that you're currently offering, some that you might want to consider offering, and it is far from a totally inclusive list, but just really begins to provide some ideas of the kinds of things that an organization can begin to offer as part of its array of services that really get you into the community. As you begin to transform, as you heard, we went from 187 beds to 34. We worked with our county partners to transform the revenue savings from that to our wraparound service program. So we really built some of the capacity in our community-based wraparound program by trading residential dollars for community-based dollars. So I know that we want to leave the last 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to kind of just quickly run through so you are familiar with where some of these slides are around the residential-based service reform. This reform, the work for it really began in 2004. Los Angeles implemented its model in 2010. We are still in the midst of some of the demonstration work, but the state did a continuum of care reform effort that went into legislation that was passed just a month ago and is now part of the direction that California is moving to really reform the way that we offer child welfare services in California. And if you get a chance to kind of run through these slides and look at them at your leisure, you'll see that the program really looks at an arc of care. We as providers went at financial risk in terms of this program. We had 52 young people in the program. The key features were really child and family teams, one plan of care. The people that worked with the young person in residential followed them to the community and stayed with them during that whole time. It had crisis stabilization without replacement, respite in the community. We had a series of outcomes that we looked at. It was a child welfare population, and I know many of you are working with the mental health population, but these were in essence the same kids. Los Angeles chose to work on a child welfare population. Some of the other reform projects in California and the other counties focused on mental health populations. It really helped us experiment and get some different ideas around this model. There were some really key fiscal and policy challenges that we faced. Collaboration with our public partner, however, was one of the key things that I think we found really made a significant difference. Having an ongoing dialogue, we sat down at the table every week with our county partners in building this model and developing it. And the fiscal model put us as a provider at risk for the work that we were doing. We got paid a rate. We guessed at what that residential rate was going to be, and agreed that if it really cost less, we would reimburse the county for that, and if we could do it at less cost, we could keep any excess savings in 10%. We also built in a opportunity to go at risk for keeping our costs down in regards to cost neutrality, but if we achieve savings, we would split that 50-50 between the county and the providers. In the first 2 years of the project, the providers saved over $1.6 million, and we're in the midst of splitting that with the county and receiving money back from the county for those savings that we were able to achieve. So the county saved half of that, and the providers were able to keep the other half of that money. This is just an example of the staffing model and then some of the techniques that we utilized to really move through and take a look at really how to achieve this. So my contact information is here, and Yvette, I'm going to kind of let you manage questions at this point.
Yes, thank you, Bill. Yeah, we're now going to begin answering questions that you guys may have. So just a reminder, if you can submit your questions through the chat feature. And so, Bill, while they're doing that, as questions are coming in, I know the one question that often comes up when we're out and conversing with folks is, you know, really understanding kind of where to start. And so what would you say were some of your biggest hurdles initially internal to your organization as you move from providing services residentially to moving them out in the community?
Yeah, I think there were several, Yvette. One is a cultural shift. When I started in '94, the organization was all on one campus. That was the organization. We began moving into the community with those services. Administration moved off into the community, off the residential campus, and suddenly the residential folks felt abandoned, and that was a significant cultural shift for us. And then it was really beginning to see the benefit that delivering those services in the community provided for us, and then helping staff really begin to develop the values and beliefs around it. There was initially a lot of resistance. There was a lot of belief that families were bad. Families did bad things to their kids and were bad people, and we really needed to begin to change those beliefs and values with the staff. Adopting the wraparound philosophy with the child and family team as the center of the treatment planning, the family at the table, parent partners there to support that family. Gradually over time, that culture began to shift and change, and we really began to value families and the input that they had, recognizing some parents couldn't parent their kids, and we needed to find alternatives, and really using the family search and engagement to help do some of that work.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. And then the other thing that we often hear is, and I think you alluded to some of this in terms of connecting with community resources, but did you find when you were moving from a residentially based kind of service to more in the community, did you find it difficult to work with schools in terms of transitioning children back there and linking them there? I hear often that is a challenge that a lot of the providers experience, and sometimes it seems that maybe kind of the one thing that is really hindering the ability to move the child back out into the community.
Did you say schools, Yvette?
Yes, schools.
Yeah. It is a challenge we are currently dealing with and experiencing with our demonstration project. educational funding went through a lot of changes in California, and one of the things that as you move to a shorter length of stay that we're finding is if you have a young person in your residential program for a short period of time and they're in the public school in your community, they're really there for a short period of time before going back to their home community. And how do you handle that and address that with either the home school or your campus school or your facilities community school? I would really encourage a lot of dialogue with the school districts, with the school systems. When we built this demonstration project, it was the one group that was not at the table as we had these discussions, and it really was unfortunate because a lot of our young people that were in the public schools were often getting in trouble, were having the school call the police. The police were putting them in the probation system, and we suddenly lose that child from the care and services that we were delivering. We've finally gotten back to the table with the school districts, are having the dialogue. We now have a leader in that school program that we're working in that's really engaged and willing to work with us, but I would agree it is a significant challenge and one that really requires a lot of dialogue because I think if New York is really similar, you're pulling kids from a homeschool district to where your residential facility is and then wanting to return them back to that district. If the child is capable of functioning in the public school, is there any way to keep them in that home district while they're at your residential facility? Would be one of the questions to look at.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bill. It doesn't seem that we have any additional questions, so I just want to thank you, Bill, and thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Bill's contact information is up on the slide deck right now, and I will be showing you my contact as well. So if there's any additional questions that you think about after the webinar, please feel free to submit them. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you could complete that and provide your feedback. And you will also receive a follow-up email within 24 hours if you are interested in getting the continuing education credit for this presentation. On behalf of CTAC and our presenter, I want to thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.